Thank you very much, Philip, for this nice introduction. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I think responsible finance, it's more than a trend, but it's a very important topic for the next 10, 20 years on the planet. Aujourd'hui, on aura la chance d'avoir des interlocuteurs qui ont leur track record dans le secteur de la finance responsable. Mais quelques mots d'introduction. Quand j'ai démarré mon premier fonds, on se souviendra à peu près il y a une douzaine d'années, je me sentais bien seule dans le secteur de la finance responsable, particulièrement en capital de risque, où le secteur technologique était tourné plutôt vers les TI que sur la transition écologique. Aujourd'hui, je me sens très bien accompagnée. J'ai la chance, avec notre équipe, de côtoyer les grands joueurs de la planète, que ce soit les Bezos, les Gates, les BlackRock. Tout le monde est au rendez-vous sur cette transformation écologique nécessaire. Et on voit déjà dans le secteur, entre autres, de l'évaluation des entreprises technologiques, une façon d'approuver cette nécessaire transition. Maintenant, je crois que le monde de la finance a un moment extrêmement important dans sa trajectoire. Post-pandémique, il y a eu énormément de réflexions de fait. Et on sait que la prochaine grande crise auquel fera face l'humanité, et non la planète, étant formée en physique, en paléontologie et en géochimie, je suis tout à fait convaincue que la planète n'en souffrira pas, mais l'espèce humaine en souffrira. Donc, c'est vraiment une occasion incroyable que nous avons de faire cette transition. Ceci dit, la transition écologique et cette transition de la finance, parce qu'on parle de finance verte, mais la finance devra aussi transitionner, nécessitera nécessairement une autre façon de faire les choses. Actuellement, nous sommes à développer un projet international de grande valeur en technologie durable et où nos sponsors nous ont demandé qu'une partie de nos bénéfices, une partie de nos bonis, de la façon de nous récompenser comme gestionnaires sera basée sur notre performance impact. Alors, ce ne sera plus que les rendements qui seront à discussion, mais ce sera aussi notre capacité, en soutenant les bons entrepreneurs, de livrer des réductions de CO2, par exemple, ou l'augmentation de la présence des femmes et de la diversité dans les entreprises. Ce tournant est fondamental parce que là, on fait ce qu'il faut faire. On aligne les grands gestionnaires de cette planète sur des enjeux cruciaux dont l'économie a besoin à développer des modèles performants qui sont à la fois écologiques et qui retournent du rendement aux actionnaires. Faut pas perdre de vue ça parce que avoir raison sans succès, ça ne sert à rien. Donc, un grand moment pour la finance, une très belle conversation aujourd'hui avec des gens qui ont du métier et surtout un immense merci à la Conférence de Montréal de poursuivre sur des thèmes aussi critiques. Et je crois que Montréal deviendra de plus en plus une magnifique plaque tournante pour ce sujet tout à fait nécessaire. Alors, Amy, je te souhaite une très belle animation. Merci d'être avec nous. On a Amy Hepburn qui est avec nous. Merci.
Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction and opportunity to lead this panel here today on sustainable finance for carbon-free North America. It is my tremendous pleasure to moderate this panel with our two experts who are joining us today. Ms. Marisa Buchanan, the Managing Director and Global Head of Sustainability for JP Morgan Chase, and Ervays Dutay, the Chief Sustainability Officer from BNP Paribas America. Thank you both so much for joining us here today for this conversation. As we talked about in the introduction, the North American economy is recovering right now from not only the devastating impact of COVID-19, but also the chronic crisis that we're seeing in climate, frankly, all over the globe. It does appear to be that we're at a moment in time where investors and governments are mobilizing for what the future is going to look like. So as we think about that, I wanted to focus our questions here today. And to those of you that are listening, feel free to share some questions in the chat, and we will try to get them to them at the end of our panel. But to get us started, Marissa and Ervays, I would love to get your thoughts on the work that you are doing currently to increase sustainable investment in your company and in your work more broadly. Marissa, let's start with you.
Great. Happy to kick off. And thanks so much for the invitation to join you today. It's really nice to be here. So we've been doing a lot of really exciting work at JP Morgan. And, climate is an issue that we know is critically important to our firm, to our clients, to our shareholders, and so many other stakeholders and communities that we work with. So we've been at this for a very long time, but I think have really stepped up our efforts in recent years. And two of the things that I'm, really proud to say that we're doing, one are that we announced a Paris-aligned financing commitment last fall, where we agreed to work really proactively with our clients to help them reduce their emissions. And the initial industries that we're focusing on are oil and gas, electric power, and automotive manufacturing. And we also announced earlier this spring a broader commitment to supporting sustainable finance. And specifically, we announced a 10-year commitment to facilitate and finance $2.5 trillion worth of capital towards companies and projects that advance a combination of sustainable development, climate, and action around sort of green and sustainability, and then also community development, specifically in the U.S. These two things together, I think, are really important because it, on the one hand, is about us setting forth clear expectations to our clients in key carbon-intensive industries that we really want to work with them to help them reduce their carbon emissions and transition to a cleaner, more sustainable future. I think the timing is such that so many of our clients are really interested in having these conversations, and they're engaging with their shareholders and clients and other stakeholders on these very issues. And this is really us, I think, coming to the table saying, we want to help you. And one of the key ways we're doing that is by growing our capacity as a bank to really support our clients on a day-to-day basis. So we've announced actually 2 new teams within our business. We've got a Center for Carbon Transition that is serving as a focal point to help our clients with access to financing, as well as advisory and research around the sort of carbon and energy transition. This is us building our capacity to support our clients. And then similarly, within our commercial banking business, which serves small and medium-sized companies in the US and internationally, we've created a new green economy team, which has providing dedicated coverage and support around some new specific emerging industries that we're really excited about: sustainable finance, as well as renewable energy, energy efficiency, and sustainable agriculture and food systems, which we know is a growing area of focus. So really excited about all of this really good work underway. I'm really pleased to say that we've got a great deal of support from our senior leadership at JP Morgan around all of these issues. And our work is not done. This is certainly a journey. And I like to say we're in the early stages of the journey, or the race, if you call it that. And, we're going to keep plugging away to see what more we can do to work on these really important, both environmental, but increasingly important social issues as well that we face globally.
Oh, thank you so much. And bravo for these early steps, as you say, for getting on the journey. Ervays, I would love to hear your thoughts on the work that you're doing.
Sure. Good morning, first of all, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. Obviously, and of course, we do very similar things. So let me give you maybe 4 lenses to read what we're doing, which is along the lines of what Marissa just described. So the first step for us is to really keep our house in order, and increasingly in greater order. So it starts by basically aligning our credit and investment portfolios with the Paris Agreement. Over the years, we took increasingly restrictive policies. I mean, starting by exiting all independence from shale oil and gas in 2017, if I recall. Our latest coal policy basically is a full exit of any financing of companies that would still have remaining coal assets by 2030 in Europe or the OECD countries, and by 2014 the rest of the world. More recently this year, going further, we announced a 10% reduction of our oil and gas lending portfolio, and we also are building a set of policies and around biodiversity, from Arctic drilling to deforestation in Brazil, and much more to come. So that's the first step, if I may say, or the first stage of the rocket. The second has been to integrate ESG within financing, investing, and even the regulatory dialogue that we have. The whole idea there is to integrate an externality that was too long ignored, that we believe is a source of financial risk, but somehow was missing the pricing stage of lending. The third element, as Marisa mentioned with their carbon transition group, for us as well, the future is not ESG. The future is really transitioning the entire economy towards new models. It's not just getting better. Unfortunately, if I may say, but it's also what will make history great. If it was only getting better at what we do, it would be easy. But it's also leaving certain things that have to become legacy, and finding new products, new ways of functioning, and this requires to be accelerated. This requires incentives, impulse, and financing. And the last thing that I would mention is the retail side. Up to now, we've mostly spoken, about the large masses, the large corporates that needs to transition, but we also do have a large focus on our retail clients, trying to promote energy efficiency among small and medium enterprises, creating products that have a social impact, as well as bringing greater access to finance, with what we call financial inclusion. So we should not forget also that dimension beyond corporates, but also individuals that do participate to this recovery.
No, it's an interesting point, Hervé, when you say that it's not about ESG, right? That we're transitioning to new models. I think that's an interesting framing. I'm wondering if, and maybe over to you, Marisa, do you see sustainable finance as the new norm? I mean, we've seen this acceleration, partly because of global events, partly because I think of, as you said, sort of this moment in time that we're in, and our historical sort of, understanding of the use of our capital flows and the externalities and trying to price those. But from your perspective of building your career in this, do both of you see this as the future? Is this the new norm, or is this a moment in time?
I'm happy to start with that. From my perspective, look, I think the growth in the sustainable finance field has been pretty remarkable. To me, it certainly signals that everything that is happening is not bad. It's not going away. But I do think there is still a lot of development to come in this field. And I think, one thing that is important to acknowledge is just the fact that, there's not one consistent definition of sustainable finance, just as there's no one universal definition of ESG and how that works. So I do think there is a lot of evolution and growth to come. And certainly, one thing that I've just witnessed over the past several years is this sort of notion of, something like ESG or sustainability being something that like a company has to manage, sort of external forces that they have to manage as a company, to thinking about, the impact that a company has externally on the environment or communities. sort of the shift to what some people call double materiality. I always say, look, you can ask, 10 different people what ESG means to them, and you can get 20 different answers. So I think what I see happening in the field right now, and we're seeing this happen in a lot of jurisdictions where regulators are looking at ESG and sustainable finance, and whether it's managing climate risk, we're thinking about regulating products and services and labels and things of that nature. You see that sort of lack of consistency. That's not to say that, different definitions or models are wrong. I think it's just really important to be very clear when we use these words and labels, to be very clear and intentional about what we mean when we use them. So I think that is an area in this field that we're going to see and need to see some continued work.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Ervays?
So I'm going to say absolutely yes, it's the new norm, but it's all news. So let me develop both points. So first of all, yes, this is the new norm. ESG is just becoming universal. Let me give you a few figures. Just this year alone, 50% of revolving credit facilities in Europe were sustainability-linked loan. We'll pass the $1 trillion mark of sustainability bond issuance this year. We're currently passing the $2 trillion mark of sustainable loans and bonds and so on. So just fast forward a few years from now, whether it's 2 or 3 or 4, 100% of finance will integrate ESG, because we're reintegrating or integrating an externality we've too long ignored. But to me, it's absolutely old news. ESG finance on its own makes very little difference, if at all, to the course of our societies. I think ESG finance, and we were a pioneer and a promoter of this over the last 8 years. I'm not talking about investing, but really financing. And it was very important to bring the dialogue. I think it's really thanks to ESG finance that was pushed by banks over the last 7-8 years that we are where we are today, where sustainability is on every lips, from banks, regulators, CNBC, or whatever. So in that sense, it had a very positive influence on society because it brought the conversation. But let's face it, ESG finance is not really changing anything today. So it's great that we go on. It's great that it's on the path to become universal and the new norm, as you say, because it's a risk that we need to price. But we need to pass the talk about bragging and being proud of this. We really need to focus on the next 29 years. Basically, we're at the beginning of probably the second greatest industrial revolution. We spent the last 270 years powering machines by burning something. We have 29 years left to keep those machines moving or operating without burning anything. And it's an amazing transformation that we have to do. And ESG finance on its own is not creating that. It's just one element or one tool in the toolbox to finance some of it. Regular finance also has its place for that. But now the focus has to move on financing this transition.
So to dig into that, and I think, Marissa, you want to jump in as well. I saw your hand. Yeah, so please do put your hand up so I can call on that.
I think Ervays is making a really important point here, which is that, at the end of the day, I think the question about whether sustainable finance is effective is a question about whether or not it's actually driving changes in the real economy. What do we see happening on the ground? And, I've sort of noticed over the years that, you see, for example, like assets under management or, that are being invested according to ESG principles growing. And yet you actually see carbon emissions in the real economy continuing to grow. So that's not to say that there are some improvements, but I think it's really important to sort of go into this with eyes wide open around what actually is this achieving. I think part of this is, and this is probably going to get to some of your additional questions, Amy, but, a question about whether or not like the finance sector is the one to sort of lead the global carbon transformation and whether finance can do it alone. In my own view, the answer is no. It's really important to have underlying policy signals to companies that actually produce and consume carbon emissions that's going to be the key. I mean, we know that there are investors that want to put their capital to work, but, we don't yet see, investors ready to say, hey, we're willing to take a huge financial sacrifice or hit in order to achieve positive impact. I mean, investors at the end of the day still need to make returns and profit for a whole variety of reasons. And so this is where, sort of rubber hits the road. It is really important to make sure that we do have the right underlying signals to the real economy and sustainable finance. The sustainable finance industry is ready to follow. And I agree, like, this is going to continue to accelerate and grow. But, we also should be realistic about what we can achieve as well.
Yeah. So let's dig into that just a minute. Ervays, maybe you're going to jump in on this. Is what needs to change? Let's get into what specifically needs to change. Ervays?
Yes. So to make the link, just to add something to Marisa just said, I totally agree what she said. To be sure, sustainable finance or the financial sector has been ahead. So now, from now on, it's not finance alone that will change things. We really need the public sector signal, as Marisa said. But at least we can take credit that for once we've been ahead of the public sector on those societal issues. And we've been the impulse or the catalyst, I would say, to that public sector. What needs to change? So yes, definitely. At this point, as Marisa said again, we've reached the point where we need the nudge from governments and regulators to go further. Let me give you a few things that maybe it will be more specific for our audience. From our perspective, first of all, we would like to see some form of common definition of what is green. We as a European bank, we believe in taxonomies. We don't view taxonomies as prescriptive, but we believe we need to be really clear on the end goal. We cannot be prescriptive on the pathway to get there because it's going to be really different from jurisdictions to jurisdictions. Everyone has a different starting point. But we really need to agree on what is the end goal in 2050, sector by sector. So from our perspective, we believe that the lack of having this as a taboo or is not helping because the goal isn't clear. The second thing is, I think overall we agree, but then we disagree on details. Mandatory disclosure it's the second step. Once you know where you need to go, now we really need some global mandatory disclosures that are harmonized and that can become aggregated and compared to see how everyone is faring along the way. If I were to go one step further, we even believe that we need some common mandatory climate-related metrics. It should not be solely principle-based. It should not be overly prescriptive, but quite frankly, we should probably very quickly agree on a Scope 3 methodology and probably some disclosure around that. So I'll stop here, but just to give you some direction, we could have named carbon tax as well. I mean, but just to give you some directions where the public sector can have a role to play, and combine with finance, we can reinforce each other in accelerating this. And just to stop, we have 29 years to achieve the goal. We probably have 9 years to have really made the sharp turn, and we probably have 3 to 4 years to have made the right decisions. So we cannot wait 2030 to agree on how to calculate Scope 3. Granted, we don't have enough time. It's never going to be perfect, but sadly, we cannot afford perfection now to reach our goals. So we need some big decisions quickly.
Yeah, no. So I'm hearing you around alignment, around metrics and definitions and taxonomies. Marisa, is there anything you would add to that in terms of, from the public policy landscape, that realm, what do we need to accelerate? Because, as Ervays, as you're saying, the time is short. And arguably the time for talking about it is coming quickly to an end. The time for action is quite upon us?
So I would say a few things. One is we at JP Morgan have been pretty vocal about the need for a price on carbon. There are a lot of different ways to price carbon, but ultimately, I think there's a really important need to price carbon as an externality so that ultimately businesses that are making long-term capital and investment strategy decisions can begin to factor the cost of that externality into their decision-making. First and foremost, that is really, really important. Secondly, and I say this with a background in energy, I hear Ervays' comments around developing a taxonomy on green, although I would say it is really important to ensure that any taxonomy that gets developed is flexible and enables finance and capital to flow not just to the darkest green activities out there, because there are so many important ways to reduce carbon emissions, methane emissions, that go beyond, for example, installing solar panels and wind farms. And it's going to be really, really important to make sure that we find a way to channel capital to sectors and activities that today are difficult to abate, and what I call are not necessarily the sort of sexy green carbon reduction opportunities, but are critically important to achieving large-scale decarbonization. And then, lastly, I would say, I know there's a lot of discussion around disclosure, and Ervays raised the comment around sort of disclosure of Scope 3 emissions. I come back to the fact that while we see an increasing amount of disclosure around carbon emissions today, and while there's a huge push around Scope 3 reporting, everyone's Scope 3 emissions are ultimately someone else's Scope 1 emissions. And we don't have sufficient, adequate, universal disclosure of Scope 1 emissions by so many companies out there. And so while I think Scope 3 is laudable, we know that accounting for Scope 3 is as much of an art as it is a science. And again, I say that as somebody with a background in greenhouse gas accounting. And so I wouldn't make perfect the enemy of the good, and focusing on sort of consistent, accurate disclosure of Scope 1 emissions that really enable companies to sort of target the source of those emissions, and do that on a widespread scale. I think that's critically, critically important.
I'd like to reinforce one point that Marisa made. Indeed, for us, the taxonomy is really the end goal, but we really believe in different transition pathways, and that's where the focus is. So for us, the role of finance nowadays is not so particularly to finance the green. The green is getting financed anyway. It's really to finance the greening of the economy. And that's precisely what Marisa was referring to, all those hard to abate sectors. And that's where all our energy really needs to be focused.
So digging into that a little bit, what is preventing our progress from your perspective, for having been in this field and thinking about it? I mean, what's preventing us from moving forward on these large? Is it national politics? Is it global politics? What do we need? What hurdle do we really ultimately need to clear for this level of collective action at the global public policy level?
So I'm happy to start. Look, I wish there were a silver bullet answer, but unfortunately there's not. It's a combination of many things. And these barriers, in many cases, are sort of specific to certain geographies and applications and industries. So in some cases, we were just talking about hard to abate sectors like steel and cement. The challenge here really comes back to technology and the fact that, right now, resources like oil and gas are incredibly energy dense, and these are what power industries like energy, like cement and steel today. And so the challenge is going to be coming up not just with technology alternatives that work, but that can also be scaled commercially at competitive cost. That's really important. The reason why wind and solar today are becoming so much more, pervasive in our economy is because, we've had years of experience with those technologies and are really able to bring those cost curves down. So one, that's really important. Another piece of it is just, sort of building the collective infrastructure required to do deployment on a large scale. Even something like, scaling solar distribution across the US, for example, it's not just about installing more solar panels. It's making sure that you have a trained workforce, that you have the right interconnection, you have the right policies that enable homeowners installing these solar panels to work productively with utilities. The cost structure has to be appropriate. And so, there are many, many things that have to get tackled, not just at the federal level, but in so many cases at the state and the local level, especially in the US. And then internationally, when it comes to development, a lot of this comes down to, for investors, is the risk profile such that they're actually willing to put their capital to work? Do you have a political and legal infrastructure that sort of, makes investors confident if they're going to invest, they're going to get repaid? There are all these things that I think at the end of the day don't get enough attention, and that I think are going to be critically important to be front and center in the conversation around how we can, continue to scale and build and deploy technologies, but actually create the environment that's possible to really make them succeed in the way that we need to.
Yeah, it's a great point. Hervé?
Yeah, from my perspective, and I was trying to find a way to say it in a politically correct way. I think at the root of it is some private interests which are going in the way. I would say I don't see the public. It's not the public sector by itself that's lagging, but it's being conflicted by a whole host of private interests, which, for legitimate reasons, find it very hard to effect this transition, and where short-termism of near-term profits or whatever are guiding different advocacy, different lobbying, different wishes, which are at odds with, I would say, the overall goal we need to have as a society. So I think that's at the root of it. Now, from there, those interests are leveraging the difficulties to make their case. And those difficulties are of two orders. One, Marisa mentioned them, it's just simply the challenge of the task. If you want to move to hydrogen, you need to transport hydrogen. If you want to move to electric cars, you need charging stations. So the infrastructure is a huge challenge. So it's easy to advocate for the old way, given the size of the task. And then the other difficulty that's being leveraged is the ways to control. Data methodologies are very complicated to get. We'll get there in a few years, but right now it's very hard to track emissions, to aggregate that, or to have the IT infrastructure for us as, for example, investors to process all of that. Of course, we do it, but the fragmentation, we're still immature globally as an industry on this. So it's another angle that can be leveraged, and to disagree on methodologies or whatever, and to buy time on this control system that could help accelerate.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. If you, going back to your original comment around it's not ESG, but it's the transition to new models. And that, what I'm hearing from both of you is that change is hard. That transition, when the rubber hits the road, it's good to talk about, but actually making the change is really, really where the challenge lies. I want to take a couple questions from the audience that have come in, if that's okay with the two of you. One here. It appears that green finance is cheaper, has lower yields than conventional finance. Do you have concerns that the yields are too low to provide an attractive proposal to investors? Who would want to take that?
So it sounds like this is a question about something that is getting a lot of attention called the greenium in the context of the green bond market, for example. So here's what I would say. Green finance is broader than just the green bond market. And a lot of what we're talking about here is actually going to come down to sort of earlier stage capital and financing that's going to be required to get a lot of these new technologies sort of developed and commercialized to a stage where they can actually get commercial scale debt financing. So that is really, really important. And secondly, I will say, I think there's been a great deal of growth and interest in the green bond market. We see that as one of the leading underwriters in the green bond market. Obviously, BNP is as well. We've seen this in JP Morgan's own issuance of green bonds. I think it is a great thing that we see so many investors wanting to put their capital to work to support green projects. But I think, the sort of next thing that we have to tackle is not just, how do you support things that are commercial today, but how do you start to support the development of things that are not yet commercial today? And in some cases, sort of, actually need, a lot of early stage support to get to a phase where they can benefit from, private scale, commercial or semi-commercial financing. Hervé, I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that.
Sure. First of all, in the green bond space, the greenium is, in the grand scheme of things, small. Whether it's 5 basis points or 12 basis points, of course, it's good. It's great for the issuers, but from an investor perspective, it's not a humongous difference. In the space of renewable energy, on the other hand, it's quite different. Deals are extremely competitive in the US, and pricing tend to be very, very competitive. Now, the first thing I would say is, if yields are low, are precisely the reflection of huge investor demand. So the investors are demanding this, and they're not finding enough deals. Now, it's good news because the focus should not be the green, but the greening. And so, if there is a demonstration that when you're green, you attract capital at better terms, this is a great incentive to spread beyond the green bubble to precisely those hard to abate sectors to find or to accelerate their transition. So overall, I see it as a good news. Either way, and overall yield should converge as we broaden the net.
Thank you both. All right, another question has come in. What do you see as the role of retail investors and clients in the sustainable finance space and the goal of a carbon-reduced economy? Hervé, you want to start there?
Sure, I can start. I see their role as extremely important because they are the voice of society. And regardless of the amount being invested, whether it's $500 or a few $1,000s, the more we have, they are saying through their money to their asset manager or to their pension funds or whatever, what they want. So their voice is extremely important. And quite frankly, they are the ones who have stimulated this production of ESG labeled funds because asset managers and others have been quick to recognize that there was a real demand.
Marissa, anything to add there? No, I think that's a great answer. And, I would just agree that, there is an increasing opportunity for retail investors to align their investment strategy with, what they feel is important to them. And that can include environmental causes, but also, many other issues as well. And the opportunity to have that dialogue with an asset manager or pension fund, I think is something that we're seeing on the rise and something that we'll continue to see, be a real focal point for the industry and the community.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And one more has come in that I think is interesting. Says people have generally been skeptical when investment companies and banks talk about sustainable financing, since it appears there has been no reduction in greenhouse gas and the world is getting warmer and climate impact more devastating. can you provide some concrete examples of successes you personally have had in the sustainable financing realm? And I suppose with this, it's defining success. As I read this question, it would be, how does one define success? But I'd be interested in your reflections.
Well, I'll start and maybe we can go back and forth.
Sure.
First,
Sure.
the first things that comes to mind is, I think as of now, we're starting to talk too much about sustainable finance with the financial community about sustainable finance. And I would agree with the implicit comment of this question. But as I said, the fact that we spoke a lot about it over the last 7 or 8 years is great, because thanks to that, we are where we are now. So now we need to move, as we discussed, to something else. I have some examples, but maybe I can pass to Marisa for a minute. But that's the first comment I wanted to say. I agree with the fact that too much talk, but thanks to the talk, we are where we are today.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, Marisa, any thoughts?
Well, I think it comes back to a lot of what Hervé and I were discussing earlier, which is, at the end of the day, you really need to have the right signals, focused on the real economy and to the industries that produce and consume, fossil fuels. And, you actually build the right infrastructure so that, businesses and others and the financial sector are able to price in carbon as an externality, which is something that we don't have universally today. Obviously, I think the industry overall has done a lot of work. We feel like we've done a lot of work at JP Morgan, reflected through the commitments that we've made over the past year. But ultimately, this is a long game. The reality is the vast majority of the energy that we produce and consume around the world is fossil energy based. Changing these systems and the way that we produce and deliver energy is not something that can change overnight. These are large, capital intensive industries, and they require not just changing sort of one piece of the puzzle, but so many other pieces of the puzzle. There's a fascinating article the other day that I was reading about, goals in the US to really, expand solar deployment. And a big piece of this is going to come down to whether we can access the supply chains, the rare earth minerals around the world that have to be mined in order to, scale the solar industry. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the complexity of what is required here. And I think if we sort of don't focus on that complexity and nuance, we're going to miss a lot of really important problems that need to be solved. So this is an effort that's going to require, I think, a lot of collaboration between the finance sector, our clients, as well as policymakers and regulators around the world in order to get this right.
And maybe I can give you some quick examples. The first one is in the energy sector. I can tell you that as some European oil and gas companies did sustainability-linked loans, other oil and gas companies want to do that. And I can tell you that these discussions have pushed, I have one example in mind, one company to accelerate their commitment to take a scope 3 target. So that's one example. The second was in the early days of SLL, but we did a sustainability-linked loan with an agri-trader. So we're outside of the energy space, but I can tell you that through intense 3 months discussion, we had 5 KPIs, 4 of which were related to deforestation. And I can guarantee you that the SLL forced them to step up their target. And last one, in the space of diversity, we did an SLL with a large private equity fund where they had one single KPI, which was simply to have at least to reach 30% of diversity on the boards of the private companies they own. And it's about 45 billion of AUM for the portfolios that are covered. And it's to 30% of diversity achieved within 2 years of ownership. So these are examples of nudge that sustainable finance has been giving. we may consider it's marginal, whatever, but it's creating a race to the top, if you wish, where it emulates competitors and peers in one sector to outbest the one who just did something.
No, I really appreciate these reflections and these questions. Thank you to those who submitted them. They were very, very good. We're nearing the end of our time together, unfortunately, and I'd like to end hearing from both of you on your call to action. For those that are listening, if you want them to take, we've covered a lot of ground. If there's one thing you really would like, those in attendance here today to take away from this conversation, what would it be? And I'll just say, 3 takeaways while you're thinking of it. 3 takeaways that I'm hearing from you all today are first, talk is easy. And action and transition is hard. And we cannot underestimate the complexity of what we're trying to do. But it is time to move beyond the headlines. And this idea that it's time to move to new models and to not just labels. And then, second, that the time is now, that we really have a very, very short window for some really big change. And the third, I heard from both of you, is the need for better collaboration. This is not a problem that finance will be able to solve alone, and that we need good market signals. We need public policy to keep pace with where we're at, and also with our restrictions as fiduciaries in this space. So that's what I heard today. But I would love to hear from both of you on what you would like us to take away from our time together. So, Marissa.
I think those are all great takeaways that you just articulated, Amy. One other thing I would just say that we haven't raised so far is just, I think the point that, a big part of, globally, the world being able to achieve the kind of carbon reductions that we're talking about needing in order to reach net zero by 2050, it's going to require that the climate solutions we have on the table ultimately work for people and communities. We've seen all too often instances where, certain policy proposals have been put on the table and, you think there's a lot of support for them. But as soon as, these changes, really sort of, bring additional costs down on people, that's when we see a sort of revolt on some of this action. So I do think it is important to acknowledge that, it is going to take a widespread and large-scale change across many different industries in order to reduce carbon emissions on a large scale. We have to acknowledge that a lot of those changes are going to bring added costs, and they're going to have an impact on people and workers. And it's going to be really important that we think about sort of climate action and sustainability, not just in the context of environment, but also in the context of what this means for people and communities, and that we're taking an integrated approach to make sure that we're addressing all these issues together.
That's a great reflection. Thank you. Ervays, you get the final word. Oh, you're on mute. Ervays, you're on mute.
It had to happen once.
Yeah, right.
No specific call to action. You summarized it well. My parting words would be, first, we have 28 and a half years left. I mean, if we need to remember something, it's that one. And we have only a few years to make the right decisions. And third and last, perfection cannot be the enemy of the good in those next 3 or 4 years to make the right decisions.
Oh, thank you so much. That is a great point to end on. And I know Marissa and Ervays, on behalf of everybody who was joining this panel today, I myself found it so enlightening and informative, but also very inspirational. So thank you for your work you are doing, and those of your organization to advance sustainable finance globally. And I look forward to working alongside of you on behalf of the Investor Leadership Network as we meet these ambitious goals over the next few years. So thank you for your time. Have a lovely day. And thank you to everyone who joined us.